Australia has 3 or 4 main grids. So there is the national electricity market on the east coast, and the NEM is an energy only market. It's one of only half a dozen in the world, so it's a somewhat unusual design. There's no capacity mechanism. We've got 5-minute dispatch and 5-minute settlement, which makes for some pretty interesting times, particularly when we talk about battery storage and e-mobility. I mean, one thing just to take a quick step back is that the Australia energy is not in the constitution. So the federal government doesn't actually look after energy. It's actually managed by each of the individual states. So if it appears that Australian energy policy is a bit of a patchwork, that is the correct answer. Managing risk in the NEM under those 5-minute volatility kind of conditions that can occur is quite challenging if you don't have physical generation. You're sort of forced onto the ASX energy market to do sort of financial derivatives trading, and it's generally easier to manage that risk with an actual physical asset.
Hello and welcome back to the last transmission episode of 2024. The National Electricity Market, or NEM, is Australia's largest energy market and one of the largest interconnected electricity systems in the world. In this episode, Alex Leemon joins Wendel Hortop to take a look at how the NEM works, the current state of battery build-out in Australia, and the unique characteristics of the system. As always, if you're enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode, and give us a rating wherever you listen. See you next year.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Transmission podcast. I'm joined today by Alex. Hi Alex.
G'day.
And this is a very special episode. So not only are we doing our first look in detail at the Australian market, but this is our first episode recorded in Australia. So Alex has come up to join me in Sydney. And I think, before we listen to what Alex has to say, which will probably be far more interesting, I just wanted to quickly point out the fact that, Modo has now moved to Australia. We've got an office based in Sydney. So this podcast is one of the first episodes we'll be doing on looking at the Australian market. And we've also got research coming out. We've just published our first deep dive into batteries in the NEM. With that all being said, that's enough about Modo. And so Alex, firstly, welcome to the podcast. I guess how long have you been kind of working in the Australian market?
I think actually my entire career since I graduated university has been energy. A long time ago, I actually worked in coal-powered stations, crawling around them, doing physical asset maintenance. And then roughly 10 years ago, went market side and worked for NEM before they became Alex, so the very large demand response provider here and globally. And then did a number of years with Flow Power, which is a sort of fairly innovative tier 2 retailer here in Australia, which does spot exposure for commercial industrial customers.
And so I think for some people who are active on LinkedIn may notice you from there. I think that's definitely the case for me. And so, firstly, big shout out for everything you do on the online LinkedIn forums to promote the kind of clean energy sort of transition in Australia. We brought you on to talk about all things the Australian market. And so for some of our listeners, this may be like the first time they're kind of thinking about the Australian power market. I mean, like kind of really high level, how are things going in the Australian power sector? I guess in terms of like, what are the clean energy goals that the country has? And what's the progress towards that so far?
Yeah, so I'd say, much like the rest of the world, we are heading towards net zero by 2050. I think we have very much officially hit the messy phase of the transition, and that's become sort of something that's kind of bubbled up through industry and has really hit the mainstream as a talking point now. We have this overarching sort of federal goal of 82% renewable by 2030, which, as uncomfortable it is to say, I think we are not on track to hit. And so a lot of those in the industry are now really starting to think about how can we actually accelerate and make sure that we don't miss the 2050 targets, because those are obviously critical and something that we've agreed to globally along with many other countries. So
I guess coming in as a sort of a bit of an outsider into the Australian market, it seems like there's a bit like a contrast here, because there is still a big reliance on coal.
Yes.
Coal is still like a massive part of electricity generation in Australia. But at the same time, there has been like enormous progress in the deployment of renewables, in general, I guess, more general electrification. And so, I guess quickly on that side of things, in terms of like the renewables, like where are we in Australia?
Yeah, so we've got, one thing just to take a quick step back is that the Australia energy is not in the constitution. So the federal government doesn't actually look after energy. It's actually managed by each of the individual states. So if it appears that Australian energy policy is a bit of a patchwork, that is the correct answer, unfortunately. So you've got states like South Australia that retired their last coal-fired power station in 2016 and have hit periods of actually over 100% renewables. And then sort of the larger states like New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland are all still very heavily dominated by coal, sort of in the order of about 70% typically, but are progressing sort of towards that, increasing renewables, and each of the state-based targets are about accelerating those renewable build-outs. On top of that, we've also got some policies. So for example, in the last 12 months, maybe a bit over 12 months ago, the Victorian government announced that they would phase out residential gas. So no new residential builds are allowed to be built with gas. And it is expected that, existing households like my own will eventually have the gas connection phased out at some time in the near future.
That nicely brings on to my next question, because obviously to go alongside the growth of renewables is like that change in electrification of kind of everything. So yeah, I guess that is a really good example then of how some of that is already happening. But elsewhere, if we look at, say, transport, what's the progress there?
It certainly feels, compared to, looking across to the UK and Europe, we are significantly behind in terms of electrification of, mobility, e-mobility. So electric vehicles are, they're beginning, they're here, they're not here, but they are still very much in the minority. You'll notice that fast charging networks leave a little bit to be desired. They're still being developed. They're getting better every day, every month, but we're a little bit behind the curve there. But then on the flip side, we're just starting to see in the last 12 months, some real acceleration in e-mobility. We've actually got a number of users of our software, for example, modeling electrification of bus fleets, which again, driven by state governments, are looking to sort of encourage private operators with those contracts to actually get onto electrification of their buses. And so I'd say that's where, from private residential or privately owned cars that are people buying EVs through to electrification of the bus fleets. And then very slowly, we're starting to see some slow electrification of, say, privately owned, last mile delivery trucks, or, that other type of haulage is slowly electrifying.
Nice. And so I think, yeah, I guess you've touched on the fact that things are quite like regional here. And that definitely is the case when we talk about, well, there is no single Australian power market.
Yes.
So I guess just very quickly, what do the power markets that exist in Australia look like? And then I think we'll focus, I guess, on the biggest one, the NEM.
Yeah. So yeah, great. So Australia has 3 or 4 main grids. So there is the national electricity market on the east coast, which covers all the way up to just past Cairns in northern Queensland, out to past Adelaide to Port Augusta and down to Tasmania. And the NEM is an energy-only market. It's one of only half a dozen in the world, so it's a somewhat unusual design. There's no capacity mechanism. We've got 5-minute dispatch and 5-minute settlement, which makes for some pretty interesting times, particularly when we talk about battery storage and e-mobility. And then over on the west coast, we have the Southwest Interconnected System, which covers sort of Perth and surrounds, and that is the wholesale electricity market, the WEM, not the Western electricity market, which would have been logical. And the WEM is actually a capacity market, so much more similar structure to the market seen in the UK and Europe, with a capacity price, and then a day ahead short-term energy market, and then a balancing price, which is known as a real-time market. And then there are 2 other smaller grids, but they're operated not as markets. So there's a Northwest Interconnected System, and then there's the Darwin-Catherine system, but they're not markets.
Yeah. So I think, and this was quite interesting to me, like when you look at like a map of the transmission network in Australia. I mean, firstly, Australia is obviously a big place.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you've got the kind of big network on the east coast that kind of spreads all the way down and then across. And then you've got the southwest corner. And then that's kind of, apart from these sort of smaller areas, I guess the rest of it is like off-grid. Is that almost what it is?
Yeah, there's actually, Australia is a country known for its mining, and there's actually a large number of mining sort of off-grid microgrids built largely around mining loads that then have, mostly powered by gas turbines and some diesel. There's actually some pretty interesting electrification opportunities there. And there is actually one, Mount Isa, which is in sort of northwestern Queensland. Project Copperstring 2.0 is a proposed interconnector to link it to Queensland's part of the NEM. But that's, again, based around the copper mine out at Mount Isa, which has sort of gas turbines powering it.
And so if we look at the NEM, because, it's the biggest kind of market, and I think it's probably where, most people who are looking at Australia will probably be looking at the NEM. Like, what would you've highlighted the fact it's an energy-only market, which I think would be really interesting to come back to. But yeah, how does it look? Because I guess it's sort of split between those 5 different regions. And, it's not one sort of market, right?
Yeah, so it's split into 5 different regions, which roughly align with the states. Not every part of each state is fully connected, but I guess the main load centers are. And then there's kind of, a maximum of about roughly 1,000 odd megawatt interconnectors between. So if you think about, something like Victoria is a sort of maybe a roughly 10 gigawatt peak system on a extremely hot day in summer. New South Wales and Queensland are both roughly sort of 12 to 13 gigawatt peak systems. We're a summer peaking market. There's only, sort of their 10% kind of interconnection capacity between each of those regions. And then both Tasmania and South Australia are connected by about 500 megawatt interconnectors, and they're much smaller systems. South Australia is about a 2.2, 2.5 gigawatt peaking market, and Tasmania is even smaller.
Cool. And then so I guess if we look at the NEM, like who would be the major parties who are kind of responsible for, I don't know, engaging in it, making it work? Yeah.
So yeah, from a regulatory perspective, we've got the acronym organization. So we've got the Australian Energy Regulator, who is the police watchdog for the market. We've got the Australian Energy Market Commission, which sets the rules and sort of manages rule changes. And then we've got the AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, that manages the electricity gas system. It's both the market operator and the system operator. And then I guess below that, then there are there's a transmission network service provider within each region. There's a whole host of distribution network service providers that, provide power out to individual customers. And then the other, I guess, noticeable thing about the NEM is Australia is famous for its competition. Well, I say that tongue in cheek, very much lack of competition. So the market is very much dominated by 3 big generators, retailers. So that's AGL, Energy Australia, and Origin, who own generating assets in most states and have customers, all up the East Coast. And so they have something along the lines of sort of a 60 to 80% market share between the 3 of them, both in sort of customer supplied load and generation capacity.
Yeah, and that's quite interesting, because I think coming at it from, say, like the UK perspective, we've seen the kind of a slow transition away from that vertically integrated supplier sort of approach, whereas here it still seems pretty strong. I mean, do you see the transition changing that, or are they each taking actions to keep up?
I think we've seen, with the rise of renewables over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, we saw certainly a proliferation of kind of new entrants to the market building wind and solar farms. We've seen a number of international kind of players come to Australia and build sort of assets down here. But at the same time, we've also seen some consolidation of those assets. We've seen kind of existing wind and solar farms bundled up and sold to other parties. I think the other thing that's perhaps significant is I have a slightly pithy joke that every retailer becomes a gentailer, because managing risk in the NEM under those 5-minute volatility kind of conditions that can occur is quite challenging if you don't have physical generation. You're sort of forced onto the ASX energy market to do sort of financial derivatives trading, and it's generally easier to manage that risk with an actual physical asset. And so if you look at the history of retailers, smaller retailers, they are starting to either use customer assets, so virtual power plants, or they are building their own wind, solar farms and batteries to actually manage that risk from a physical perspective.
Interesting. And so that neatly brings me on to my next question, which, I think to dive into a bit more on the technical detail of how the NEM operates. Because for me, I think when I first started looking into it, maybe 3 years ago, I was like, this is such a cool, just from a pure power markets perspective, from a bit of a nerd perspective, such a cool design of a power market. And so, you said, so it's an energy only sort of 5-minute market. In practice, what does that look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, ironically, the NEM economic theory design came from the UK. We stole the UK's market design 1.0 from the early 90s and ran with it when the UK transitioned to a capacity market in sort of their second design. But in practice, it's a 5-minute market. A couple of years ago, 2021, we shifted to 5-minute settlement as well. And we have one of the higher of the energy only markets. We have one of the higher price caps. It's currently $17,500 per megawatt hour. And that kind of volatility is actually extremely important for driving investment in new generation assets, because there's no, forward markets, there's no capacity market. That volatility actually becomes a really important driving sort of pricing signal for investors in the market here. And then also, interestingly, Australia has certainly been at the forefront of negative pricing. So we have a floor of negative $1,000 per megawatt hour. And as we've seen, sort of renewables build-out has risen in the NEM, and we've also seen the rise of rooftop solar over roughly the same period. We've seen a very high preponderance of negative pricing, to the point that all regions are now experiencing something like 30% of the entire year is at negatively priced intervals.
Yeah, I think that's wild. Like, because coming from the UK and Europe, I think this year more than ever has seen kind of like the explosion of negative pricing. But even then, it's sort of 5% of the time. And so to be running at like 30% of periods negative is pretty mad.
Yes.
And yeah, I think it shows kind of where like kind of Europe and those other areas which have kind of built out a lot of solar may well get to. And so I think I think one thing that's kind of interesting, again, if we kind of contrast, I guess, to those European markets. So firstly, I guess the NEM is centrally dispatched, so AMO sort of run everything, right?
So it's a security constrained economic dispatch. So its generators submit bids day ahead, and then it's a pay as cleared market. Generators can bid in 10 tranches. I think what's perhaps slightly unusual about the NEM is there's no technical gate closure. So you see pretty frequent rebidding right up until 5 minutes before the affected interval, which has a lot of implications on volatility and volatility management. And then perhaps the comment about the security constrained economic dispatch is that there is a whole series of quite complicated constraints that are used to manage the network, which can lead to sort of some, areas of the network getting sort of entire, like, congestion in the network is managed by these sort of real-time constraints, which has particularly come to affect some of the renewable generators in recent years. There are entire sections like the northwest of Victoria or the southwest of New South Wales that are very congested because there's great solar and wind resources there. So everyone wants to build there, and then it's hard to get that power out to sort of Melbourne and Sydney, the load centres respectively.
Yeah, and so, if I kind of look at it, like in the UK, we've kind of got energy, which is traded, and then this kind of constraint issue is all kind of solved. Well, there's like one wholesale market, and then this constraint issue is all solved via the balancing mechanism. So it's sort of like a second order effect of figuring that out. Whereas in the NEM, that's all just done as part of the one sort of energy optimization.
Correct.
And I guess that kind of speaks to why there's some of that pricing volatility, because it's not just taking in energy, it's taking in these constraint issues as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it leads to a real, potentially investor risk, is that you identify a site, it has, good conditions for sort of, weather, you've done kind of pricing analysis, things look pretty good, and then you build the asset, and then it actually turns out that, there are 5 or 10% of intervals that you actually can't be dispatched for. And an energy only market, that now means you're earning absolutely zero revenue. And then sometimes that's ironically compounded by those constraints and congestion may sometimes be the times that are very highly priced. Particularly the interconnectors become very congested and constrained around some of sort of the peak demand volatile periods. And so you might have a generator, trying to sort of generate power to get to, what is a peak demand period. And if the power, is congested, constrained, then you're earning nothing, and the price might be above $10,000 per megawatt hour, and it can be hard to, justify the investment then, or to make the money back in a reasonable time.
Yeah, so there's like a lot of detail to like break down, even
Yes.
like at that sub state level, like kind of locationally within states.
Yeah, and it's become a really key piece of that investment puzzle for project developers, understanding, what do forward prices look like in a market, what's that congestion, curtailment, constraint risk, how can that be managed, and then also, what are other people doing around them, because we've also seen the rise of, so marginal loss factors are used. We don't have we're a zonal pricing market, and then marginal loss factors are used to account for the actual location of generators. And we've seen people who were, say, first movers build a solar farm in a sunny part of the state. They were fine. And as people have come and built solar farms on the same transmission line closer to load centers, their marginal loss factors have reduced by 10 or 20%, which is a bit of a kick in the guts.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so I think for me, one thing I just want, like, especially for some listeners, again, who are coming from maybe like European perspective, the biggest thing, even from the US, it's a 5-minute market that's dispatched entirely only at that 5-minute interval. There's no sort of like day ahead market. There's like, they see bids day ahead, but essentially nothing's solved at that point. And yeah, so it just runs entirely on this like every 5 minutes, just running.
Yep.
That's the way the entire market operates. And I guess that is what leads to that volatility. I think that's like a natural consequence of that. And yeah, I think it kind of raises some very big. So, for example, thinking about how you'd optimize a battery in that space when you don't really then know what's coming in the next period and the next, really kind of raises some pretty interesting questions on how you approach it. And I think that neatly brings me on to talk about, I guess, batteries in the NEM. I think so. Some people may be aware of kind of Hornsdale Power Reserve or the Tesla Big Battery, which was essentially the world's first big battery that famously kind of came out of a bet. I don't know in real life, like actually how much truth there was to that.
I think it was the early, or not early days, but Twitter. Mike Cannon-Brookes, the CEO, co-founder of Atlassian, atted Elon Musk on Twitter, and Elon Musk said that he could deliver it in 100 days, and it was more or less delivered that 100 megawatt, 150 megawatt hour battery delivered. It's actually since been upgraded. It's now 150 megawatt battery.
Yeah, I think that's pretty it doesn't. It's kind of weird to think about in time. It doesn't feel that long ago now, but actually in 2017, that was like right at the early beginnings of the battery energy storage space globally. Like even in the GB market, there was maybe like approaching 100 megawatts operational at the time. And it's definitely kind of, I guess, continued, right? Like that big battery focus. So what does battery capacity look like today in the NEM? And what's on the way? So I guess that's probably the more interesting question.
Yeah. So the rise of the utility scale batteries continued. There's about 2.1 gigawatts of installed capacity at the moment. They keep getting bigger. There is very, very soon the new next biggest battery is about to come online, the Waratah Super battery from Acacia, which I think is a gigawatt, which is very large. Over in the WEM, the Collie battery is being built at the moment, and so that's a 500 megawatt 4-hour battery, which will become Australia's new biggest battery in terms of storage capacity. And then even further down the track, we've just seen a couple of batteries have won tenders from the New South Wales long-term energy storage agreements, and so they're now 8-hour batteries and some very large capacities. So there's a fairly large pipeline of something about 7 gigawatts in sort of anticipated and proposed batteries. And then I did actually check recently, there's 98 gigawatts or something insane in the sort of maybe proposed, may or may not get built. So a very large pipeline of maybes, but definitely about 7 gigawatts in the anticipated.
Yeah, so like a lot of interest in getting batteries built, which I guess on one hand kind of makes sense when you look at that power market, like the volatility in it. That's exactly what batteries are great at solving. But then I guess the flip side of that is there's no capacity market. There's very little in terms of like contracted or guaranteed revenue to get these things built, which I don't know, I guess that like kind of, has there been anything which has been behind getting that capacity built?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two things that have happened. I think one, there's been sort of early movers of standalone battery have taken advantage of that volatility, and the ancillary services markets, the FCAS markets here in Australia, have actually been major value drivers, particularly in the last couple of years for batteries, where we're starting to see what I'd call the early days of saturation and prices starting to come down since a sort of a peak of the last couple of years. But ancillary services have been big parts of the revenue stacks of large batteries. We've also seen, I think, a lot of co-location of batteries. So people who built solar farms and wind farms initially as standalone assets and have seen declining wholesale revenues, particularly due to negative pricing and some of those congestion risks. And so it's logical to invest in a battery as a co-located asset, as a physical management of that congestion risk and some of that market risk. And then much more recently, we've seen a number of government, what I'm cheekily calling proxy capacity mechanisms. So we've got, the New South Wales long-term energy storage arrangement, the LTESA, which then blueprinted the federal government's capacity investment scheme. And that's very much around incentivizing 4 and 8 hour sort of, large scale batteries, as well as new renewable builds, and providing, it's not a true capacity mechanism, but it's about providing sort of revenue guarantees to project developers based around the spot price, but it provides sort of floor and cap on revenues. And then just in the last month, we've seen the South Australian government announce the firm energy reliability mechanism, which is very similar, but includes gas, because the gas is excluded from the capacity investment scheme.
Yeah, I was looking through it, and there were some bits of it which looked like they borrowed quite heavily from like capacity markets in the sort of Europe and the UK, but then then it's like not a capacity market. That's just
Yes.
yeah.
I think, and again, I am a bit cheeky in this, but I think the capacity markets have been a somewhat contentious point and get raised, like much like locational marginal pricing. They're something that get raised sort of on a 6-monthly basis and get often battered down by sort of people who are pretty proud of the NEM energy only design and keen to keep it that way. But I do think there are some serious challenges with investing in an energy only market and encouraging that investment. And I think the existence of things like the CIS and LTESA and FIRM are sort of a implicit acknowledgement that investing in an energy only market is challenging.
Yeah, and I guess the only other thing I just want to highlight is that I guess we have also seen like kind of state governments like kind of take some actions to bring batteries online. So if we look at again Hornsdale, it had this sort of like reserve contract to come online, and then similarly, I guess we've seen similar in Victoria,
The Victorian big battery.
yeah, Victorian big battery, and then New South Wales now with the Waratah super battery, which again, yeah, is kind of maybe more from the again looking at it like the state governments have been from that side, it seems like they can be a bit more interventionist than we maybe are used to kind of in Europe.
Yeah, I think it's funny. The NEM is a fully private market. That was one of the conditions of kind of establishing the NEM, but it probably has more government involvement than many people realize. So, for example, most of the generation in Queensland, or certainly the existing kind of gas and coal generation and the hydro units are actually all state government owned via corporatized sort of entities. New South Wales for a long time was all sort of corporatized entities, although it's largely been privatized now. But Snowy Hydro is federally owned, and Snowy Hydro is quite a big player, probably actually sits not far below the big 3 gentailers. And as an election promise a couple of years ago, Victoria brought back the State Electricity Commission, the SEC v sort of, version 2.0. And part of that promise was, again, a consumer-led focus of trying to provide power, cheaper power and greener power. But again, it gives them sort of that heft of government to be able to throw behind supporting projects, whether that be these sort of, guarantees of revenue, underwriting schemes, or, sort of capacity light sort of contracting mechanism. Governments have been quite heavily involved, particularly recently.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned there's like kind of like 97 gigawatt pipeline. I guess within that, do you think there's enough that like kind of realistically will get built to achieve kind of the targets and the transition that Australia needs?
I think the battery pipeline and what's being built to date looks pretty healthy. I guess I'm a long way from an expert on what's quite needed to hit those targets, but it certainly looks healthy and battery projects have been progressing really well. I think the big challenge that actually seems more likely is building, the actual generation, clean generation, renewable generation projects that then provide, the actual power into the system for batteries to shift around has been more challenging. So building wind in this country has really slowed down, and we need a lot more wind, particularly because it obviously has a more, a less diurnal profile than solar. Like, it's very easy to build solar in this country, but we need more than just solar to hit our transition goals.
Yeah, and I think like, I guess, you naturally kind of think about Australia as a sunny place, which it is. But I mean, since I came here, like it's been it's very windy. And so, yeah, it kind of seems like a bit of a no-brainer to try build out that wind generation. But I guess that very quickly just comes back to that transmission constraint issue again, which is then also building the transmission infrastructure to support that.
Yeah, it's been a big topic of kind of discussion recently about the big transmission build out required to support these new assets, these new both renewables and batteries. There's lots of very large numbers floated about. The build out of transmission, both the cost and the slowness of it, has led the opposition federal government to wedge their little sort of pro-nuclear culture war thing, which is honestly kind of a nothing, just a furphy, a distraction in the actual energy transition story. But it has been that the challenges building a transmission have been able to kind of underpin that argument to essentially get air in the transition topic, honestly.
Yeah, in terms of running the grid, the system, like what are the challenges that are faced, I guess, by AEMO? Yeah, like kind of day to day.
Yeah, I mean, I think one is this kind of legacy of the patchwork of states, which are really, we call it the national electricity market, but it is a patchwork of state systems which are glued together by the interconnectors, which is still causes a lot of challenges day to day. And so increased interconnection is one of those potential ways to address that. But I think also day to day in the last couple of years, we've seen the emergence of minimum system demand. So Australia now has just over 20 gigawatts of rooftop solar sitting behind the meter, which is at times larger than the entire generation capacity of the coal fleet in Australia, which is kind of nuts. But it's leading to these periods where, we're hitting essentially this, what AEMO is calling the minimum system load, where it believes that if the demand on the grid were to drop any lower, we'd be in extremely unstable territory. And so it's led to things like in South Australia basically forcing gas generation on to provide inertia and synchronous generation, and that comes at a cost, and not just the carbon cost, but a physical cost for paying them to come online. And it's led to a brand new concept of a minimum system load announcement, which matches the lack of reserve announcement, which is to cover peak demand opposite. And so there's lots of things going on there, including very unpopularly, AEMO has been talking about basically kicking people's rooftop solar off via essentially over voltage control. It's a hammer, it's a blunt mechanism to help that, but it's been quite unpopular. People taking private assets and kind of kicking them off the grid is not popular with consumers, understandably.
Yeah, and so because I think if kind of looking at it as kind of this energy market, but then AEMO as a system operator can take actions kind of outside of that to direct participants. So I guess in the instance of the minimum system load, instruct batteries to sort of essentially discharge so that they can charge up during the middle of the day. And I guess in the inverse, during the kind of the peak periods, they can do the flip side of that. So instruct batteries to hold high state of charge, right?
Yeah, we actually saw an example of that just last week. So New South Wales had very high temperatures, particularly so New South Wales, very high temperatures in the west of Sydney, Penrith and Parramatta, so to drive the centre of the load. And that led to extremely high demand on the system. There were a number of coal-fired units that were offline unexpectedly, so there was sort of less generation available in the system. And AEMO issued directions for both Walgrove and Waratah battery and Waratah still in sort of commissioning phase, to maintain a certain level of state of charge, presumably as a kind of AEMO doesn't have to quite state their reasons for that, but as I guess as an emergency backstop, that there would be some state of charge left in the battery in case things really went down south.
Yeah, and so I guess just to put a timestamp on where we are. So we're recording this the first week of December, and so I think last week then we saw that period of, I guess you kind of have this weird thing where there's these forecasts which state we're going to have the price cap be hit for 4 hours, and it doesn't seem to quite ever get to that point. But we did see that prices in New South Wales hit $17,500 for quite a lot of periods.
Yeah, it was certainly hot. It certainly was a test of the system. I think it is interesting. That's kind of one of those kind of consequences of the energy only market, is that high prices are generally, obviously, high demand and sort of stress on the system from a reliability perspective are usually associated with high prices, but those things are technically separate. You can have rare instances of sort of reliability system problems and low prices, and you can have vice versa, where you get very high prices and there's kind of, relatively calm demand. But last week was sort of both, which is more typical.
Yeah, so I think basically to wrap that up, I think if anyone gets their kicks out of, power market volatility, take a look at the NEM. And so I think that brings me on to the final question, which is, Alex, what is your contrarian view?
Love a contrarian view. I am a cynic on the projected rise of data center growth due to AI tools. I am not convinced that the growth in AI is there sustainable enough to actually drive some of the fairly wild projections we're seeing in data center demand. And I do think actually we're being a little bit the electricity industry is being led by the sort of the AI industry, which is obviously fairly hyped up at the moment. And I think we've seen some of this happen before. For example, a lot of the smelters back in the 80s, which drove lots of wild promises about electricity usage and pricing, and it actually caused a lot of headaches for the industry sort of 30, 40 years ago. So I am wary of that.
Okay. It's a good contrarian view. So the kind of AI data center gigawatts hype may not quite come to fruition.
Might, but
Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. I think it's hopefully been a really insightful episode for our listeners. And so final little thing for me is, again, just to keep your eyes out for sort of research from Modo coming out on the NEM if you found this interesting. But thanks, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening to Transmission, a Modo Energy podcast. Transmission delivers conversations from industry leaders and experts exploring energy markets and the operations and technologies related to grid-scale battery energy storage. Check out our other episodes by searching Transmission wherever you get your podcasts. Check out the Energy Academy, our video crash course on how markets in Great Britain and ERCOT work, or head to modoenergy.com to see our written research. Thanks for listening.